Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lesson in our series on an introduction to metaphysics. In this lesson, what we're going to do is ask the question, what is metaphysics? And then we're going to talk about the scope of this series of lessons in the future before talking about the future of metaphysics on this channel, essentially. So, as an introduction, if we look here, we are going to be doing this as an introduction to the study of metaphysics, hence the name of this series. And this is supposed to complement all of the other introductory series of philosophy that we're going to be doing. We have a general introduction to philosophy series, which will focus on the ideas of logic and argumentation within philosophy. We're going to do an introduction to metaphysics, an introduction to ethics, an introduction to epistemology, and an introduction to political philosophy. Now, like I said, we're going to try and look towards getting a working definition of metaphysics, examine the importance and beauty of the subject of metaphysics, why it's one of my favourite subjects personally, and why I always, when I was an undergraduate at university studying philosophy, I always was attracted to the metaphysics and advanced metaphysics topics. And then we're going to look at the scope of this introductory series to examine exactly what we're going to be looking at in the kind of detail that we're going to be looking at it in. Now, I'll just put right now as a disclaimer that this is an introductory course on the subject of metaphysics. The aim is to be broad in terms of subject matter, but then a little bit more lax in terms of specific detail. So this series is going to be about 8 lessons long, and we're going to spend one lesson on each of the major topics within metaphysics, which means that we're not going to be able to go into the kind of in-depth analysis that you might expect from a metaphysics course, but the reason for that is because, of course, we're going to do a more advanced series of lessons in the future that go into far more detail and have far more lessons attached to them. So, let's think about this question then. What is metaphysics? What do we mean when we are studying metaphysics? Well, just like with the definition of philosophy, metaphysics is also a subject which is notoriously difficult to define adequately. There are some areas which tend to be quite they tend to be quite metaphysical in terms of their subject, but you might not describe as metaphysics. And then there are some areas which are not particularly metaphysical, which you might study in metaphysics. These are all different ideas that mean that essentially a working and an adequate definition of what metaphysics actually is can be difficult to accurately delimit. Now, most dictionaries or encyclopedias will suggest that metaphysics is essentially the philosophical study of the fundamental building blocks of reality. That is quite a nice way of defining it. I quite like that because it is broad enough in the sense that it means that we can encompass all of the topics within metaphysics. We can study the philosophy of time and the philosophy of modality in the same sense because they are both talking about fundamental building blocks of reality. Ultimately, as well, metaphysics looks to take an examination of some of the most abstract and most difficult questions and try and provide some answers to them. Now, one of the things that we are going to talk about in future lessons is looking at the various different critiques of metaphysics, because in some cases, metaphysics can be said to be so broad and so unfalsifiable in some ways as to the ability to even come to a definite right or wrong answer to some of the questions, then it begs the question whether or not metaphysics is even worth doing in the first place. And so that is going to be a series of lessons in and of itself, but it should be worth noting that that's one of the things that's quite interesting about the subject of metaphysics, that it is so broad in some senses that even some individuals within the academic world of philosophy critique the subject itself. Another way of defining metaphysics is to suggest it is the study of being, becoming, and reality itself. Being, the nature of being and existence, what it means to change and persist in reality, and then the reality in which existence can be defined. That's another way in which some people have thought about trying to define what metaphysics may be. According to Hall from 2012, however, metaphysics looks to answer 2 questions in both the abstract and the fully comprehensive manner. Metaphysics firstly asks the question of what it is that exists, what actually exists in reality, and then what that thing is like. What it is like to exist and what it is like for that thing to exist. Those are two ways in which we can define metaphysical questions as well. Now, if we look at the etymology of the phrase, just like what we did when we looked at the etymology of philosophy, we talked about what philosophy is, how some people have defined what a philosopher is and what it means to study philosophy, but then we also looked at the etymology of the phrase itself, philosophy of course deriving out of the ancient Greek love of wisdom. What do we mean when we look at the etymology of the phrase or the word metaphysics? Well, again, it derives from the Greek. Meta often refers to above or after, and physics refers to the study of physics. And this has led some to believe that you study metaphysics as almost the natural, logical consequence of studying physics. And the term may have first been coined by Aristotle, essentially the idea being that you study physics, you study the science of physics, and once you've fully comprehended the study of physics, you then study what comes after physics, i.e. metaphysics, some of the more abstract questions that pertain to reality and existence. Now, one of the reasons for this is because in the ancient Greek period of philosophy, there was not that much specific delineation between what is science and what was philosophy. Many of the philosophers were also natural scientists, also came up with a number of different inventions and different scientific discoveries. And so as a result, philosophy and physics sort of melded together as a sort of one all-encompassing subject. But it implies that metaphysics is somehow superior to physics, or is somehow something that you have to master physics for first in order to understand metaphysics. You don't have to have a prerequisite understanding of physics in order to understand what metaphysics is. That is just not true. Because whereas physics studies the mechanical workings and the mechanical understandings of how things work, metaphysics asks some of the more fundamental and philosophical questions about those subjects. So, for example, you will study time if you did a physics degree. You will study what time is, how time operates, how time relates to space, things like general relativity and special relativity, the influence of and the dilation of time in relation to speed or in relation to bends in space-time as a result of gravity, etc., etc., etc. But when you study time in metaphysics, you don't ask those questions. You ask the question, okay, well, what is time? What does time flow? Is time real? Is the past real? Is the present real? How does time flow? These are all these kinds of questions that are metaphysical in nature. So given all these pieces of information, like I said, the point of this series is to provide you with an introductory overview of some of the most basic and fundamental questions within metaphysics itself. And so what we're going to do is talk about each of the major topics within metaphysics in their own separate lessons, and then this will essentially provide the precursor to a more advanced series of lessons in the future. We're going to begin by talking about ontology and existence, what the philosophy of ontology actually means, what does it mean to exist, what is a thing, essentially, is the answer to that question. We'll talk about the idea of identity within metaphysics. We'll talk about space and time. We're going to talk about the philosophy of causation, a thing being caused by something else. We'll then talk about the metaphysics of cosmology and physics and the universe, before finishing on some of the more subsidiary issues. Do we have free will? What does it mean to have free will? Could we subscribe to a fatalistic universe or a deterministic universe? And then finally, we'll ask questions about the philosophy of mathematics, the metaphysics of mathematics. Is maths invented or discovered? What are numbers? Are numbers real? What kinds of ways in which we can essentially subscribe to a coherent metaphysical understanding of mathematics? These are all the questions that we're going to ask in this series of lessons. Now that we have taken an introduction to the study of metaphysics, what I'm going to do in this lesson is start to talk about some of the ways in which we can approach the subject of metaphysics. And this involves an examination of what is sometimes described as the study of metaphysics. And this falls into the broader introductory chapter that we are exploring in this lesson and in the next lesson as well, in just providing something of a basic overview and a basic foundational understanding of the subject before we then start to explore what some of these sub-disciplines within metaphysics actually entail. So things like the philosophy of time and the nature of time, things like the concept of modality and persistence and causation, things like the subject of ontology, all of which are going to be very important for our study of metaphysics, which is going to be the encompassing of this series of lessons. So, as a brief introduction already, we know from the previous lesson that we outlined essentially the answer to the question, what is metaphysics, as a branch of broader philosophical inquiry. Now, we're going to talk about the formal study of metaphysics in this lesson and look at some of the challenges which may be presented in the examination of the study of metaphysics. So, according to Loux from 2014, of which there are up-to-date editions of her textbook relating to the subject of metaphysics, they say that the distinctive goal of the metaphysician, i.e. an individual who studies and who practices metaphysics, the distinctive goal of the metaphysician is to understand the structure of reality. Now, this is quite a nice, neat, and easily all-encompassing subject, or at least sentence which outlines what metaphysics essentially is. It also gives us a particularly broad collection of subjects for study. But this also begs the question, is metaphysics a single unified subject? Can we argue that in the study of metaphysics we can uniformly and accurately delimit the borders of where metaphysics begins and where metaphysics ends? Now, according to Loux from 2006, metaphysics is the most general of all the disciplines, i.e. all the disciplines presumably in reference to disciplines in philosophy. Its aim is to identify the nature and structure of all that there is. This again highlights this idea of metaphysics being broad and metaphysics being potentially something which is not a single unified set of subjects to study. And in this regard, because of its generality in terms of the ability for it to identify the nature and structure of all that there is, it further adds to the question as to what the study of metaphysics actually entails, the extent to which it is a single unified subject, and not just a broad term which is used to describe a collection of disciplines. So, as a result of which, maybe it is not so accurate and not so prudent to study and come to a definition of what metaphysics is, but rather to explain and look at the kinds of questions that metaphysics asks instead. And this is a shift away from looking at the study of metaphysics as a broad subject in and of itself to looking at the subjects within metaphysics, the questions of philosophy that metaphysics essentially asks. Some of the key questions that are asked in the study of metaphysics include, what is the nature of existence? What is time? What is the nature of time? Is time real? Does time exist in terms of its entirety, from the past to the present to the future, or only certain components of time real? How does time flow? What is the nature of change? What does it mean for something to change from point A to point B? To what extent can you understand identity in relation to change? What is the nature of causality? To what extent can we talk about the causation from one event to another? And if we are to argue that everything does have some kind of cause, taking something of a Kalam cosmological argument, if you will, and just sort of butchering it in order to apply to the general studies of metaphysics, could we then argue as a result of which that human beings don't have free will, owing to the nature of causality? According to philosophers Van Inwagen and Sullivan, there are two distinct subsets of subjects which we describe as metaphysics. These are problems of the new metaphysics and problems of the old metaphysics. And it relates to something that we're going to touch on in the next lesson, which is, of course, examination of the history of metaphysical inquiry. But for the most part, when we talk about metaphysics, we can make this delineation. We can make a delineation between the subjects of old metaphysics and the subjects of new metaphysics. And we can trace this examination in this philosophical tradition throughout the history of the subject. According to old metaphysics and the kind of subjects that are studied therein, we are thinking about debates in relation to, for example, the nature of being and the concept of substances and universals. The questions of new metaphysics, however, look at debates around the nature of time, the concept of persistence, causality, modality, and ontology. I've written there persistence twice, but ultimately we're talking about ontology as well, and causation and free will, all of which are essentially elements of the old metaphysics, but have been morphed into different subdivisional subjects. So the concepts of substances and universals, but then also the ability for us to understand how those substances and universals actually relate to each other and exist in the world and in reality itself. In this final lesson, examining an introduction to the subject of metaphysics, what I want to do is talk about the history of metaphysics. Now, as a basic precursor and a warning to you who are studying these lessons, this is going to be an overview introduction to the history of metaphysics. The concept of a very detailed and in-depth analysis of the history of metaphysics is not one that we can essentially squeeze into a 10-minute short lesson on the subject. In fact, a history of metaphysics could potentially be a series of lessons in and of itself as part of a general history of philosophy set of lessons. If any of you is interested in us doing a history of metaphysics series of lessons, then let us know. We can actually think about doing that in the future. But for now, we're just going to be taking a very brief overview to the history of metaphysics, mainly talking about the relationship between metaphysics and physics, or more broadly, metaphysics and science and the scientific discipline, and the place of metaphysics in this particular conversation. So, we know from our first lesson on the topic that the word metaphysics, the etymology of the phrase itself, originates from the work of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle didn't himself coin the term metaphysics, but it was the name given to a collection of works which were written by Aristotle, a sum of total of 14 books, and they were classified under the following heading: ta, meta, ta, pusika, or physica. Now, at the end of the day, what this actually means in translation is essentially roughly translating to after physics, ta, meta, ta, physica. Okay? And another way in which we can translate that is to essentially describe it as metaphysica, metaphysics. And so we get the phrase metaphysics as a result. And you could probably understand that given these books roughly discussing issues of what we would describe as metaphysics today, they're titled essentially the quote after physics or metaphysics or post physics. One may be getting the impression, therefore, that the study of metaphysics is somehow a study of a subject to which physics itself may be subordinate. And you might find some philosophers who share that view even to this day, that metaphysics is by far a superior subject compared that to the study of the physical world and to physics more generally. However, though, today most people would probably argue that it's not the correct interpretation of what we actually mean when we talk about the idea that Aristotle essentially coined, which is this idea of post-physica or after physics. Nor does it necessarily suggest that one has to therefore study physics before turning on to metaphysics, suggesting some kind of temporal element to the study of each of these subjects. The idea being that as soon as you have mastered the subject of physics, you should then go on to look at the subject of metaphysics afterwards. So, it should also be noted that metaphysics, even though it is given the name meta, it has the sort of prefix that is meta, is not necessarily suggestive of the subject being a second-order inquiry into the subject of physics. There are definitely elements of metaphysics that share similarities in terms of content and subject matter to the study of physics. So, for example, in future lessons' time, we're going to be talking about the metaphysics of time and the philosophy of time. Now, time is a subject that is studied quite significantly in physics as well, when you do things like special and general relativity, and you talk about quantum theory, etc., etc. And so there are definitely crossovers there, but to suggest that you could then go from studying the philosophy of time and being able to understand the basic principles of general relativity as a result would be a little bit naive. I wouldn't advise anybody to go and do that. Equally, if you study general relativity, that doesn't mean automatically that you have a fundamental and foundational grasp of the philosophy of time. They are still, despite covering similar content and similar subject matter, i.e. this phenomenon that we describe as time, they are still nevertheless distinct inquiries. And so as a result of which, to suggest that metaphysics is somehow a second-order inquiry into the subject of physics would also be misleading. So with all that being said, what do we actually mean about what metaphysics is? Well, if we remember back to our previous lesson, and we look at the studies from our previous lesson, we noted that when we look at metaphysics, we're fundamentally concerned in the nature and the fundamental understanding of reality, which again is something that is an issue that also concerns itself in physics. If you were to ask a physicist what their job is, what the idea of physics fundamentally is, they would probably answer by saying something along the lines of, my job is uncovering the fundamental nature of reality. And I guess when you study things like string theory and you study things like quantum mechanics and special relativity and cosmology, you are probably looking into and trying to understand how reality is put together, how the world works, how the universe works. Some philosophers argue that the subject of metaphysics concerns itself with looking at the nature of reality beyond its mere appearance, and instead talk about the meaning of reality and looking beneath the curtain, if you will. But given the historical development of the disciplines, you can understand why there is a close interconnection between the idea of metaphysics and the ordinary subject of physics. Because from the perspective of the history of philosophy, especially early on when we talk about the ancient and medieval period of philosophy, we know that there was very little delineation made between the study of subjects of science and the study of philosophy. Ancient philosophers would contribute significantly to the discovery of scientific advances, and vice versa. You would find that there are a number of very accomplished scientists that have also made contributions to the subject of philosophy. Even as late as the early 20th century, do we see a gross interconnectedness between what are described as the natural sciences or the physical sciences and that of the philosophy and that of the philosophical world. People like, for example, Bertrand Russell, being a very famous philosopher, wrote Principia Mathematica, which is, of course, a very deeply logical and mathematical piece of work, to the extent at which it actually probably crosses into the realm of mathematics as well as the realm of philosophy. Equally, ancient philosophers have contributed to the discovery of various different scientific advancements. Individuals like Pythagoras contributing to a lot of work in relation to mathematics. In and around the 1600s, you start to see the growing distinction made between science and philosophy, but this is still not to suggest that philosophers were not also scientists at this time. People like famous philosopher René Descartes contributed to mathematics in a number of ways through the establishment of the Cartesian coordinate system, something that is studied in every mathematics class to this day. Equally, you have people such as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who not only will we be referencing at multiple points in our studies in metaphysics, but also was one of the people who invented calculus, which is, of course, so instrumental to our study of physics and understanding a lot of the physical world. If we take ourselves to today, though, the common understanding is that metaphysics, while distinct from physics and two completely distinct subjects, serves its own useful purpose, given supposedly looking behind the curtain to see how things really are compared to how they merely appear to be. And so as a result of which, to suggest that metaphysics is useless in some way, or metaphysics is subject to a number of critiques, is something that has a lot of debate within philosophy. But to that extent, in order to understand this, it is useful to understand essentially what metaphysics inquires. And so that's what these introductory lessons have been trying to essentially digress onto individuals. We will get to looking at critiques of metaphysics in the future, because there are some seemingly valid critiques that you can levy against the subject of metaphysics. The extent to which metaphysics is even meaningful or verifiable is a question that we can ask in the future. But for now, we're going to start to get into the brass tacks of this subject, beginning first with the philosophy of ontology.